The early morning of June 6, 1944 reached the German command posts. France as a cascade of reports, paratroopers detected inland, communications cut in several sectors, and naval activity off the coast of Normandy, for Field Marshal Gers, supreme commander in the west. From his headquarters in Mano, the immediate problem was not to confirm whether this was the main invasion that became clear within the first hours, but to determine whether there was still room to expel the enemy before it consolidated an operational logistical port. The answer depended on decisions that were no longer in his hands. German defensive system in Normandy responded to a structural contradiction that had remained unresolved for months. Field Marshal RML, responsible for Army Group B covering the Channel coast, had insisted on concentrating the armored divisions near the beaches in order to destroy the invader in the first hours. The High Command from Berlin preferred to keep the armored reserves in depth for a massive counterattack once the definitive point of invasion had been identified. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one. Static divisions without real mobility defended the coast, while the armored formations remained scattered in land, subject to a centralized authorization system that required explicit permission for any significant movement. When that authorization arrived on June 6, already well advanced Allied aviation controlled the sky and the mathematical time for a decisive counterattack had been consumed. Allied air superiority was not an abstract concept for German divisional commanders. It was an operational reality that degraded mobility to unsustainable levels. The 12th SS Division, one of the elite formations available, received orders to move toward Caen on the morning of June 6. Under normal conditions, it would have arrived within a few hours. Under constant air attack, it had to disperse, camouflage itself, and move mainly at night. It arrived fragmented with mechanical losses and without the concentration necessary to break the beachheads. This pattern was repeated with every unit that attempted to approach the front. The distance between the order and its effective execution stretched to the point of turning counterattacks into belated reactions against an enemy that had already entrenched itself. For General Dolman, commander of the 7th Army defending Normandy, the first days revealed an impossible equation. Each hour that the Allies held the beaches increased their density of troops and material on land. Every German attempt to concentrate armored forces at a point of breakthrough encountered an environment in which daytime movement was equivalent to an invitation to air attack. The terrain of Normandy, with its hedge, small fields, and narrow roads, offered excellent defensive positions for infantry, but turned large-scale tank maneuvers into slow and fragmented operations. The battle was transformed into sector attrition, close-range fighting for villages and crossroads, not into the war of movement that they had perfected in previous campaigns. The struggle for illustrated how an apparently tactical decision could have profound strategic consequences. For Field Marshal RML and his subordinates was more than a city. It was the hub of routes that controlled access to the interior of France, and a point from which a British advance could threaten the entire eastern flank of the German deployment. The command decided to hold it with the best armored divisions available, formations that had originally been intended for use in mobile counterattacks. The result was that units such as the Lair, the 12th SS, and the 21st became fixed static defensive fighting around, acting as plugs against successive British offensives. This fixation had a decisive strategic effect, while the best German reserves were being worn down in eastern Normandy. To prevent a British breakthrough, the American front in the west accumulated pressure without facing comparable armored resistance. The problem was not only tactical, it was logistical in a structural sense. The Allies had solved the challenge of supplying an invasion without large ports through the creation of artificial harbors and continuous landing systems on the beaches. For General Commander of the 25th Army Corps, this meant that the enemy could sustain its offensive indefinitely, while they depended on a rail and road network on systematic bombardment. At the tactical level, the shortages manifested themselves at critical moments. Batteries that had to ration ammunition during enemy artillery preparations, tanks that could not maneuver due to lack of fuel, wounded soldiers who were evacuated late or not at all. Attrition ceased to be a concept and became the concrete reason why a position held one day and collapsed the next. While Normandy absorbed attention in the west on June 22, 1944, the Red Army launched operation against Army Group Center in, for Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of that Army Group, the blow arrived with a magnitude that exceeded all expectations. The Soviet offensive was not a simple frontal attack. It combined simultaneous penetrations along multiple axes, breakthroughs through overwhelming artillery superiority, and exploitation by mobile forces that sought to dismantle the structure of the front. Not merely push it back. In less than 2 weeks, Army Group Center, the pillar of the Eastern defensive system, disintegrated. It was not merely a matter of territorial loss. Entire armies were encircled, command centers were captured or destroyed, and the withdrawal turned into dispersion. For the German High Command, represented by the Under and the operational staff under Alfred Jodl, the simultaneous collapse on 2 fronts created an internal competition for non-existent resources. In the East, armored divisions were needed to plug Soviet penetrations and restore a coherent line. In the West, those same divisions were needed for a concentrated counterattack to expel the Allies from Normandy before they consolidated their position. Each transfer of a formation to one front automatically weakened the other. The decision, when it was finally made, always arrived too late to alter the outcome in either of the 2 theaters. The dilemma was not abstract. When the 2nd SS Division des Reich received orders to move from southern France to Normandy in mid-June, it took 2 weeks to arrive, a movement that in 1940 would have taken days. Attacks by the resistance, constant air harassment, and the need to travel along secondary routes turned the transfer into an operation of attrition even before entering combat. Meanwhile, in the East, divisions that could have reinforced Army Group Center were down in the West, unable to influence a crisis unfolding thousands of kilometers away. The geography of a 2-front war became an operational trap with no solution. By late June and throughout July, the magnitude of the Eastern crisis forced that front to be prioritized. The collapse of Army Group Center threatened critical routes toward East Prussia, exposed Germany's minor allies in Eastern Europe, and suggested the possibility of a Soviet advance to the Vistula before autumn. For Field Marshal Walter Model sent to stabilize the situation, the task consisted of rebuilding a front with remnants of destroyed units, improvised reserves, and without the capacity to counterattack in depth. Each kilometer that the Red Army advanced consumed railway infrastructure, fortified cities, and positions that had taken years to prepare. In the West, July became the month of extreme attrition with no prospect of a decisive breakthrough. Caen fell partially under British and Canadian pressure, but the German front, though exhausted, held. General Hans, who had replaced as supreme commander in the West, understood that the idea of a decisive battle to break the beachhead had vanished. The objective was now more modest: to delay, inflict losses, and by time to build a defensive line to the rear. That time never came. On July 20th, the failed assassination attempt against introduced an additional factor of instability. The subsequent purge disrupted balances of trust within the high command, produced changes in key responsibilities, and reinforced a climate of suspicion at a moment when cohesion was essential. For commanders such as, gravely wounded days earlier in an air attack, who would fall under suspicion and commit suicide in August, the episode had a corrosive effect on tactical freedom of action precisely when the enemy was forcing them to improvise. On July 25th, after an aerial bombardment that disorganized the western front of Normandy, American forces launched Operation Cobra. The breakthrough was not immediate, but within a matter of days, it became clear that the German line had been shattered in depth. For the divisional commanders in the sector, the problem was not only the enemy penetration, but the impossibility of reconstituting the front. The armored reserves were tied down at Seine. The command infrastructure was disorganized. An Allied air superiority turned every attempt at a counterattack into a costly and futile exercise. By the end of July 1944, the German operational map showed an inescapable reality. In the West, Normandy had ceased to be a battle to contain the invasion and had become a struggle to avoid the encirclement of entire armies. In the East, Army Group Center no longer existed as a coherent structure, and the Red Army was approaching the Vistula. The strategic outcome was decided. What would follow would not be a defense of the empire, but the management of a collapse that would unfold over the months to come. Every decision of the German High Command from that moment onward would not seek to alter the final outcome, but to delay it in the increasingly irrational hope that time would produce a fracture in the enemy coalition that would never come. The German defeat in France did not begin with an orderly retreat or a clear strategic decision. It began with a fatal mismatch between speed and reality when Operation Cobra was launched on July 25, 1944 in the American sector of Normandy. The prior bombing was devastating but not decisive in itself. What was truly lethal occurred afterward. In the hours and days that followed, when the German command system proved it could no longer react at the speed demanded by a modern war dominated by air power, Field Marshal Gah, newly appointed Supreme Commander in the West, understood almost immediately that the breakthrough was not a simple tactical problem. The German front had not been penetrated at an irrelevant point, but in a sector that protected the exit to open ground. The divisions that were supposed to contain the blow, the lair and the second division, had not been destroyed, but were disorganized to the point of losing their capacity for coordinated reaction. Entire units were left without communications, without clear orders, and without the possibility of concentrating in time. Tried to do what German doctrine had prescribed for years, to counterattack with armored units to seal the gap before the enemy could exploit it. But in 1944, that doctrinal reflex clashed with an insurmountable reality. The available reserves were not concentrated. They did not have enough fuel for a deep maneuver, and above all, they could not move by day without being detected and attacked by Allied aviation. The order for a counterattack was given, but the designated units took more than 24 hours to reach their starting points. By then, the front had already ceased to exist as a coherent line. The problem was not the lack of soldiers or tanks, it was the speed. The German decision-making system, centralized, hierarchical, and dependent on higher authorizations, operated at a pace that had been adequate in 1940, but in 1944 it was lethally slow. Each hour of delay not only allowed the enemy to advance at their ability to do so. For General Commander of the 7th Army, the situation became critical. By the end of July, his forces were divided between two incompatible realities. In the east, they were still holding off the British and Canadians around Caen. In the west, the Americans were advancing with increasing freedom. When elements of the U.S. 8th Corps reached on July 30th, the geometry of the front changed completely. Was not just a city, it was the gateway to Brittany and, more importantly, to the interior of France. From that moment on, the danger was no longer a penetration but an operational encirclement. Requested authorization to withdraw toward the Seine and save the bulk of his forces. The response from above was different, a counterattack. The order to attack toward, conceived as a way to cut the Allied bottleneck, made sense on the map, but it ignored the real conditions of the army that was supposed to execute it. The divisions assigned, among them elite armored units, were not in a position to launch a sustained offensive. They lacked fuel, were scattered, and had to concentrate under a sky completely dominated by the enemy. The attack, launched in early August, achieved a limited initial surprise. For a few hours, some American positions were penetrated, but at dawn, when the weather cleared, Allied aviation intervened with crushing force. What had begun as an attempt at recovery turned into a trap. The German divisions engaged were fixed in combat while the enemy maneuvered to encircle them. Germany could still attack, but it could no longer sustain the attack long enough to have strategic consequences. That was the point of no return. While the best German units fought at mortar, the Allied forces advanced from the north and south. This is how this pocket formed, not as an accident, but as the direct consequence of a decision made too late and with insufficient means. When Field Marshal Walter arrived to take command of the Western Front in mid-August, he found an army on the verge of disintegration. His diagnosis was immediate. If a total retreat was not authorized, the army in France would be destroyed. The authorization came, but it was too late. The escape corridor had been reduced to a narrow passage, constantly battered by artillery and aviation. For the trapped troops, the retreat was not a maneuver but an organized flight under fire. Entire columns advanced by night, abandoning tanks, guns, and vehicles that could not move due to lack of fuel or because the roads were blocked by burning debris. Some divisions managed to escape, but they did so as shadows of their former selves. The 12th SS, which had entered Normandy as a full division, exited the pocket with barely a few hundred men and a handful of operational tanks. Though one of the best divisions in the German army ceased to exist as a functional unit, even more serious was the loss of heavy artillery and experienced mid-level commanders. Without them, a division was nothing more than a name on paper. When the remnants of the German army crossed the Seine, France was already lost, not because of the fall of Paris, but because the military instrument necessary to defend it had been destroyed. General, responsible for the French capital, understood that turning Paris into a battlefield would not change anything. Defending it would have consumed troops needed to attempt to stabilize a line further east. His decision to surrender. The city intact was less a political act than a military admission. Time was no longer working in Germany's favor. Disaster was amplified a few days later with the Allied landing in southern France. For General, in charge of that sector, the situation was desperate. His forces had already been weakened to reinforce Normandy, and now they faced a new front with clearly insufficient means. He opted for an immediate retreat to the Rhône Valley, attempting to save what he could before being trapped between two advancing Allied armies from the north and south. The retreat was constant, harassed from the air, and left his divisions exhausted even before reaching the German border. By the end of the summer of 1944, the German Western Front no longer existed as a continuous structure. France had been lost not by a single battle but by the progressive destruction of the army that was supposed to defend it. What remained were remnants, names, commanders without enough troops and troops without the cohesion necessary to maneuver. Germany was now withdrawing to its own borders, trying to rebuild a defense with increasingly scarce human and material resources. And while this was happening in the West, the rest of Europe was burning. Italy continued to consume divisions that could not withdraw without causing an immediate collapse. In the East, the Red Army stopped only to better prepare itself. Germany had lost France, but it had not yet made its final decision. That decision, a desperate bet to change the course of the war with a single blow, was beginning to take shape. When the remnants of the German army reached the western border of the Reich in September 1944, what arrived was not an army defeated in the classical sense, but something more unsettling, a force that still fought with determination, but had lost the ability to recover. The divisions retained their names, their flags, and their formal hierarchy, but they no longer had the human or material depth that made prolonged warfare possible. The central problem was not just how many men remained, but what kind of army Germany was now. The West Wall line, the former freed line, became the anchor point of this new reality. On the map, it was a formidable defensive barrier of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions. In practice, it was a line held by incomplete units hastily formed with uneven training and a chronic shortage of mobile reserves. The German High Command knew that a fortified line without the capacity for counterattack could not stop a modern offensive. It could only delay it. The rebuilding of the Western Front revealed just how exhausted the German replacement system was. The new soldiers were increasingly younger or too old. Many came from the Marine, transferred to the infantry because there were no longer enough planes or ships to employ them in their original specialties. Airfield technicians, anti-aircraft gunners, and port sailors were formed into infantry battalions with accelerated training. They fought with discipline but lacked the experience necessary for a war of attrition. In September, the Allies attempted to accelerate the end of the war with a bold maneuver, Market Garden. The plan aimed to cross the Netherlands, capture a chain of bridges, and open a direct corridor to the heart of industrial Germany. From the German point of view, the attack was an operational surprise but not a decisive blow. The defense around was organized with improvised means, and with units that were there almost by accident in the process of resting or reorganizing after Normandy. The German defensive success was real but misleading. It did not represent a strategic recovery but rather a pause. The front temporarily stabilized in the north, but Germany did not gain new reserves from it, nor enough time to reorganize its army. It simply gained weeks that the enemy could afford to lose and that Germany did not know how to exploit. Further south, the war took on a different, more brutal and symbolic character. The first major German city on the Allies' path became a symbol of resistance with no hope of victory. Its defense was fierce, house by house, using old fortifications and improvised positions. For the defenders, it was not about winning but following orders and delaying the enemy. For the High Command, Aachen was a calculated sacrifice, time in exchange for destruction. The city fell in October. With it, any illusion that the western border could be held indefinitely disappeared. Urban combat had shown that Germany could still inflict losses, but also that it could no longer prevent the enemy's advance. Every city defended was another point on the calendar, not a step toward a strategic solution. The same pattern was repeated in the forest. There the terrain worked in favor of the defender, the dense Vegetation, the rugged relief, and the weather limited the Allied superiority in tanks and aviation. For Germany, was not a battle to win but a battle to consume every Allied advance. Cost time, men, and material, but the structural difference was clear: the Allies could replace their losses. Germany could not. The wear and tear was mutual, but the result was implicit from the start. Meanwhile, on other fronts, the situation continued to deteriorate. Italy kept absorbing divisions that could not be withdrawn without causing an immediate collapse of the front, holding a barrier in the made defensive sense, but it was a strategic luxury that Germany could hardly afford. However, abandoning Italy meant opening the way to Austria and the Southern Reich, an option that political leadership systematically rejected. The east, the threat was even more severe. The Red Army had reached the line and maintained deep bridgeheads that pointed directly to the heart of industrial Germany. The front seemed stable, but that stability was deceptive. It depended on the enemy choosing to wait, and that was an extremely dangerous assumption. In this context, the German High Command reached an unsettling conclusion. Passive defense meant certain defeat. There were not enough resources to sustain a war of attrition on all fronts. If Germany wanted to change the course of the war, or at least delay its end, it needed more than resistance. It needed a strike. Thus, the idea for the offensive was born not as a conventional military plan, but as a political gamble disguised as a military operation. The logic was clear, though desperate. An unexpected attack in the west through a sector considered secondary could divide the Allies, capture key ports, and provoke a political crisis that would open the door to negotiations. It was not about militarily defeating the United States and Great Britain, but about fracturing their will. The problem was that the plan required conditions Germany no longer controlled. It relied on bad weather to neutralize Allied aviation, fuel reserves that barely existed, and a speed of advance the army was no longer capable of maintaining. Still, the decision was made to go ahead, not because it was feasible, but because there was no better alternative. The preparation for the offensive revealed just how much Germany was betting its last cards. Armored divisions were withdrawn from other fronts, even from the east where the Soviet threat was growing. Fuel was stockpiled at the expense of weakening entire sectors. Ammunition was concentrated for a single operation, and at the same time there was created a popular militia intended to cover basic defensive functions and free up regular troops for the offensive. It was an implicit admission that the Reich no longer had enough trained soldiers to cover all its needs. Within the High Command itself, warnings emerged. Some generals pointed out that concentrating resources in the west left the eastern front dangerously exposed. The Soviet bridgeheads were not a future threat but an immediate one, but those warnings collided with a political decision that had already been made. This offensive was not conceived as one option among many, but as the last available option. By the end of November 1944, while divisions secretly concentrated in the forests, Germany had reached a point of no return. The Reich was already fighting on its own borders. It had lost France, it had lost the strategic initiative, and it had lost the ability to absorb mistakes. Everything now depended on a single gamble launched against an enemy numerically superior and materially overwhelming. There was not a plan to win the war, it was an attempt to change the way it was losing it. If it failed, there would be no reserves, no time, and no margin for correction. Winter of 1944 to 1945 was approaching as a final opportunity, but also as a sentence. Germany was about to stake everything on an offensive that even before it began depended more on hope than on reality. The final blow in the west in the crossing of the dawn of December 16, 1944 marked the moment when the Reich played its last offensive card in the west. After hours of preparation in absolute silence, German artillery opened massive fire on scattered American positions along the sector. For General Commander of the U.S. First Army, the first hours were marked by operational confusion. Reports were communications were cut off, and the scale of the attack took time to comprehend. From the perspective of Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, responsible for the operation, the first day confirmed that tactical surprise had been achieved. The American divisions in the sector, mostly newly arrived units still acclimating or veteran, worn-out units sent to a quiet front, were overwhelmed at several points. The dense fog and low visibility neutralized Allied aviation temporarily, creating the conditions the plan required, a battlefield where ground mobility and artillery fire once again became decisive as in the 1940 campaigns. General commander of the 6th SS Army on the northern axis of the offensive, knew that he had a narrow time window. His divisions, the 1st SS, the reconstituted 12th SS, and the 2nd SS totaled nearly 500 tanks on paper, but their operational autonomy depended on reaching Allied fuel depots within the first 48 hours. The plan assumed that the armored formations would advance along specific axes, quickly overcome the initial resistance, and reach the Meuse River before the enemy could reorganize its reserves. The political objective was clear: reach, cut off Allied logistical lines, and provoke a crisis that would fracture the enemy coalition or force negotiations. The military objective was more modest but equally difficult: create a deep salient that would force the Allies to divert resources from other fronts and buy time for the Reich. The reality of the terrain imposed immediate limitations. The roads of the narrow, winding, covered in snow and mud became saturated with columns of vehicles. The Piper, the elite combat group of the 1st SS under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Piper, advanced aggressively along the northern axis, seeking fuel and bridges over the Meuse River. Piper achieved a penetration of over 40 in 2 days, captured small fuel depots, and panic in the U.S. rear, but his advance was halted when key bridges over the river were blown up before he could secure them, and when American resistance organized around critical crossings. Without enough fuel to continue and without infantry support to protect his flanks, Piper was isolated. On December 24th, after abandoning his vehicles, he led the survivors of his camp grouper back to the German lines on foot. His penetration, the deepest of the entire offensive, had not altered the operational balance. Further south, General, commander of the 5th Army, executed a more methodical advance, but was equally constrained by logistics. His formations, the 2nd, 116th, and the reconstituted Lair, penetrated the American lines and advanced toward intermediate objectives. The 2nd Division reached Celles just a few kilometers from the Meuse, the closest any German unit came to the strategic objective, but it arrived without fuel, without infantry support, and exposed to Allied counterattacks. On December 26th, elements of the 2nd U.S. Armored Division destroyed the German vanguard. The division that had come closest to the Meuse lost most of its tanks without having crossed the river. The operational turning point was the small city. A critical road junction at the center of the salient was surrounded on December 20th, when elements of the 101st U.S. Airborne Division entrenched themselves there. For an model represented an immediate problem. As long as it remained in enemy hands, the main routes through the salient were blocked. The German armored divisions had to detour through secondary roads, losing time and fuel. Attempts to take the city through direct assault executed by the 26th Grenadier Division and elements of the 47th Corps failed due to the organized defense and U.S. artillery fire. When General George redirected his 3rd Army from the south and broke the siege on December 26th, it became clear that the offensive had lost momentum. The improvement in weather from December 23rd onward returned the air initiative to the Allies. U.S. and British tactical aviation systematically attacked the moving German columns, the improvised fuel depots, and the road junctions. For the German division commanders, this meant that every daytime movement became a high operation. The units still advancing did so at night, losing coordination and speed. Those trying to regroup were detected and attacked. General reported to Marshal Model that his SS divisions had consumed their fuel and ammunition reserves without achieving significant operational objectives. By the end of December, Model, from his command post, understood that the strategic objectives Meuse-Antwerp fracturing the coalition were unattainable. The offensive turned into a struggle to preserve the committed forces and avoid a disaster greater than. At the beginning of January 1945, the Allies began the systematic reduction of the salient from the north, south, and west. For the German divisions trapped in the Bulge, this meant continuous defensive combat under increasing pressure. The retreat officially began on January 8, when Model received authorization to withdraw his forces to their original starting line. The retreat operation executed under artillery fire, constant air attacks, and the threat of encirclement cost them much of the heavy material it had concentrated for the offensive. Tanks without fuel were blown up by their crews. Artillery that could not be towed was abandoned, and entire columns were trapped on roads blocked by snow and debris. When the front stabilized by the end of January, approximately on the Line of December 15th, the operational balance was devastating. The figures reflected the magnitude of the failure. The armored divisions that had participated in the offensive, 11 in total, had lost between 50% and 70% of their operational tanks. The infantry had suffered casualties that could not be replaced with equivalent quality. Personnel, even more serious, the consumption of fuel, ammunition, and material had exhausted the Reich's last strategic reserves in the West. Marshal, head of the OKW, informed that the material losses in the equaled 3 months' worth of industrial production at a time when German industry was operating under constant bombing and raw material shortages. For General Jodl, chief of the operational staff, the strategic consequence was clear. The German Western Front no longer had enough mobile reserves to launch significant counterattacks. This offensive capacity in the West had been consumed in a gamble that had not altered the political or military balance. While the bled out, the Eastern Front faced its own definitive crisis. On January 12, 1945, 4 days after Model began to withdraw his forces in the West, the Red Army launched the Vistula Offensive. General had warned for weeks that the Soviet bridge heads in and were concentrating artillery, armored units, and engineers in quantities that signaled a large-scale offensive. His reports were received at this headquarters, but the reserves that could have reinforced the Eastern Front were committed in the when the Soviet artillery bombardment fell on German positions along the Vistula, the defenses held by incomplete divisions, remnants of formations destroyed in 1944, and contingents disintegrated in a matter of hours. General Harper, commander of Army Group A responsible for the sector, reported that Soviet penetrations had broken through his front at multiple points and that he lacked reserves to seal them. Marshal, commander of the First Ukrainian Front, exploited the breakthrough with tank armies that advanced deeply, aiming to encircle fortified cities and cut off retreat routes. In 2 weeks, the Eastern Front shifted from the to the distance of over 500 in the central sector, cities like Warsaw, and fell in rapid succession. For the German command, the loss of these cities meant the destruction of critical rail hubs, logistical depots, and the last defensive depth before the Reich's own territory. In East Prussia, the Soviet offensive from the south and east created progressively tightening encirclement. General, commander of Army Group Center in that sector, tried to maintain a land corridor to the west, but the speed of the enemy's advance made it unfeasible. By the end of January, East Prussia was isolated by land. The German formations deployed there, among them veteran divisions like the 5th, were fighting in a pocket with no prospect of a land evacuation. Operation Hannibal, the maritime evacuation from Baltic ports, such as Seine, became the only escape route for both troops and civilians. Hundreds of thousands of people were evacuated on warships and civilian transports under constant risk of Soviet air and submarine attacks. The sinking of the on January 30th with over 9,000 casualties among refugees and military personnel illustrated the human cost of the eastern collapse. On the central axis, the Soviet advance reached the river by the end of January, establishing bridgeheads on the western bank, especially opposite. For the German command, there was the last major river barrier before Berlin. Only 70 separated the Soviet bridgeheads from the capital. General appointed commander of the hastily created Vistula Army Group to defend the received heterogeneous mix of forces, remnants of divisions withdrawn from Poland, reconstituted formations with personnel units from the youth, and improvised battalions of personnel without aircraft. On the map, the Vistula Army Group appeared solid. In reality, it lacked mobile reserves, sufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged bombardment, and fuel for defensive maneuvers. Presented with a detailed report on January 27, the Eastern Front urgently needed reinforcements from the West, withdrawal of divisions from secondary fronts such as Italy and Norway, and concentration of all available reserves to stabilize the Oder. The response was partial. Some divisions were transferred from the West, among them the 25th Grenadier, but the units that arrived were worn out from the and lacked the necessary heavy equipment. The decision to maintain large contingents in Italy, Norway, and the Balkans reflected the High Command's loss of strategic clarity. The Reich was defending all fronts simultaneously without sufficient concentration on any one of them. In Hungary, the German effort to defend the oil fields and hold Budapest consumed critical resources without operation. Result: the relief offensives launched in January by the 6th SS Army moved from The failed against organized Soviet defenses, the loss of Budapest on February 13th eliminated the last German stronghold on the Middle Danube, the SS. Divisions that had fought there, the 1st, 12th, and 2nd as Reich, were far below their theoretical strength without altering the strategic outcome in the southeast. While the Eastern Front temporarily stabilized in the west, the Allies resumed the initiative with operations aimed at clearing the western bank of the Operation Veritable, launched on February 8th by Canadian and British forces in the north, and Operation Grenade launched by the U.S. 9th Army on February 23rd placed Marshall Model's Army Group B under sustained pressure, the German defenses based on the West Wall improvised positions and units reconstituted after the offered tenacious resistance but lacked the capacity for a counterattack. General Kurt, commander of the 1st Paratrooper Army, defended the lower sector with formations that kept traditional designations, but whose actual composition included contingents, remnants of destroyed divisions, and battalions untrained for intensive ground combat. The capture of Cologne on March 7th by the U.S. First Army marked the loss of the last major German city on the western bank of the. When the U.S. forces reached the river, the German command had ordered the destruction of all bridges to turn the into a continuous defensive barrier, but on March 7th a failure in demolition coordination allowed elements of the 9th U.S. Armored Division to capture the bridge intact. For Lieutenant General Botch, responsible for defending the sector, the failure was the result of contradictory orders, a shortage of explosives, and the speed of the enemy's advance. Subsequent attempts to destroy the bridge using artillery, Me-262 jet bombers and combat divers failed. When the bridge finally collapsed on March 17th due to structural damage, the Americans had already established solid bridge head on the eastern bank. For General Model, the loss of was more than a tactical failure. It demonstrated that the could no longer be defended as a continuous barrier. The presence of an enemy bridge head on the eastern bank forced the diversion of scarce reserves to contain it, weakening other sectors. Marshall, transferred from Italy to replace as supreme commander in the West on March 10th, inherited a front where strategic options had been reduced to managing retreats and defending sectors with inadequate forces. The local counteroffensives he ordered to reduce the bridge head ran into Allied artillery and air superiority, the German units attacking, including the 11th Division and elements of the 9th, suffered disproportionate losses without succeeding in restoring the river line. The massive crossings carried out by the Allies between March 22nd and 24th completed the breach of the last major geographical barrier before the interior of Germany, Operation Plunder. The crossing of by the British-Canadian 21st Army Group in the sector was preceded by an unprecedented artillery bombardment density and supported by airborne drops deep into enemy territory. General Alfred, commander of the 1st Paratrooper Army responsible for the sector, had divisions that barely amounted to battalions in actual strength. The defense disintegrated in hours. Further south, the crossing of the 3rd Army executed with tactical surprise on March 22nd, demonstrated that even sectors less prepared for amphibious assaults could be crossed when the defense lacked reserves to counterattack. By the end of March 1945, the operational map showed the Reich compressed towards its core. In the west, the Allies had established multiple bridgeheads east of and were beginning deep exploitation operations. In the east, the front was anchored on with Soviet bridgeheads pointing directly at Berlin. The Reich was no longer fighting to recover territory or alter the strategic balance. It was fighting to delay the inevitable final collapse and manage how the war would end. The internal collapse of the Reich and the offensive on Berlin, April 1945, began with the operational certainty that the Reich was facing its final disintegration in weeks, not months. In the west, the Allied encirclement maneuver around the Ruhr Basin, the industrial heart of Germany, was completed on April 1st, when elements of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies met at closing a pocket containing Marshall Model's Army Group B. For Model, commander of more than 300,000 soldiers trapped in the pocket, the situation offered no viable operational options. Ordered the defense of the Ruhr as a fortress, transforming each city into a stronghold and maintaining industrial production for as long as possible, but the reality on the ground contradicted the order. The steel factories of Essen, the chemical plants of and the armament complexes of Dortmund were operating with constant Interruptions due to shortages of raw materials, electricity, and transport. The RU was not defending a functional industrial base, but the remnants of one. Model organized defense in concentric sectors using cities like Essen, Dortmund, and as resistance centers, the formations. Under his command, remnants of divisions, reconstituted infantry units, and contingents lacked the mobility to break the encirclement. Attempts to coordinate exits eastward failed due to the speed with which the Allies exploited any German movement. Allied artillery and tactical aviation turned the main routes into death zones. When Model requested permission to evacuate personnel eastward and surrender the pocket, the response from Berlin was clear: resist until exhaustion. The reduction of the pocket was carried out through systematic pressure from all flanks. U.S. divisions penetrated the urban defenses using a combination of massive artillery fire, armored support, and coordinated infantry assaults. By April 18th, the pocket had fragmented into isolated with no communication between them. Marshal Model, aware that organized resistance had ended, formally dissolved his army group on April 17th and authorized his subordinates to surrender or attempt to escape individually. On April 21st, Model committed suicide in a forest near. His death symbolized the end of the last major German military formation organized in the West. Surrender of approximately 325,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr between April 18th and 21st, eliminated in one stroke more divisions than Germany could reconstitute. For general, the loss of the Ruhr meant that there was no longer a coherent Western front. The German forces that remained active west of the Elbe, fragments of divisions, local garrisons, rear units fought in isolation without centralized command or a common strategic objective. Cities like Bremen, Hamburg, and Hanover were declared fortresses but lacked the necessary mobile reserves to defend such extensive perimeters. Local as garrison commanders evaluated that prolonged resistance would only increase destruction without altering the outcome. While the West collapsed, the Eastern Front faced its final crisis. By the Soviet concentration on the reached a density that surpassed any previous operation of the war. Marshal, commander of the First Front facing Berlin, and Marshal KV, commander of the First Ukrainian Front. To the south gathered over 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 pieces of artillery for the final offensive. General Commander of Army Group Vistula, responsible for the defense of the, had on paper 500,000 soldiers organized into the Ninth Army, facing the CEO Heights and the Third Army north of Berlin, but these figures concealed a desperate operational reality. Many divisions consisted of only 2,000 to 3,000 men, lacked sufficient heavy artillery, and depended on rationed ammunition. On April 16, 1945, at 3:00 a.m., the Soviet artillery bombardment fell on German positions along the magnitude of the fire described by survivors as a phenomenon that surpassed any previous experience, disrupted the defenses, destroyed improvised bunkers, and severed communications. General, commander of the Ninth Army, reported that entire sectors of his front had lost contact with Corps command and that the surviving units were retreating toward the CEO Heights without coherent orders. The German defense at CEO, a key position that controlled access to Berlin from the east, relied on using the elevated terrain to create converging fire zones on the attackers. On April 16th and 17th, Marshall's forces suffered severe losses as they ascended the heights under artillery fire and German tanks entrenched in positions, but the material difference was decisive. Every destroyed German position was replaced by renewed Soviet fire. Every German counterattack consumed reserves that could not be replenished. On April 18th, the CEO Heights fell. For this meant that the last organized barrier before Berlin had been overcome. The Ninth Army began a retreat to the west, seeking to avoid the encirclement that Soviet tank armies were attempting to complete from the north and south. Further south, Marshal KV exploited his own advance, bypassing the frontal defenses and penetrating deep into the interior. On April 19th, the Soviet vanguards reached the southern outskirts of Berlin. On April 25th, the link between Soviet and American forces at Togo on the Elbe definitively fragmented German territory. The Reich was divided into isolated compartments: Berlin and its surroundings, the northwest under admirals' command, the south in the process of disintegration, and isolated pockets in East Prussia, Czechoslovakia. The defense of Berlin was organized under the direction of General, who was appointed commander of The city on April 23, when Soviet forces were already penetrating the peripheral districts, received a force that reflected the final exhaustion of the German military system, remnants of the LVI Corps. Battalions from the division formed with training personnel, contingents from the SS police, and units from the youth. The city was divided into defensive sectors, each commander with nominal authority over forces that often were not known to him and lacked reliable communication with Central Command. The defense relied on turning every street into a position, every building into a fortress, and every intersection into a point of resistance, but this strategy depended on ammunition, food, and reinforcements that no longer existed. Urban combat began in earnest on April 26 when Soviet units from the 3rd Shock Army penetrated the northern part of the city and forces from the 8th Guards Army advanced from the south. The fighting developed street by street, building by building, with Soviet tanks providing direct fire against fortified positions while infantry systematically assaulted each position. The German defenders used ambush tactics, panzer against isolated tanks, snipers in buildings, improvised mines, but lacked the capability to counterattack and reclaim lost ground. Each sector that reduced the defensive perimeter and compressed the defenders towards the center of the city. On April 28, General Widding reported that his forces had been reduced to approximately 40,000 effective combatants scattered over a perimeter of less than 10 in diameter centered on the government district. Communications with the Spunker were intermittent, the orders arriving defend to the last man, await reinforcements coming from the west, had no basis in operational reality. General Commander of the 12th Army, which was theoretically supposed to relieve Berlin from the southwest, reported that his forces, mostly improvised divisions with young recruits and insufficient equipment, were blocked by vastly superior Soviet forces, and that any attempt to penetrate towards the capital would result in the destruction of his army without altering the outcome in Berlin. On April 30th, as Soviet forces were fighting less than 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery bunker, committed suicide. His political testament designated Admiral as his successor. Death did not alter the immediate military situation. The city remained surrounded with insufficient ammunition and no prospects of relief, but it removed the political justification for continuing a fight that had no operational meaning. On May 1st, requested authorization to attempt a breakthrough to the west. His response was ambiguous, maintained resistance while negotiating a general surrender to the Western Allies. On May 2nd, ordered the of resistance and personally surrendered to the Soviet command. The Battle of Berlin was over, the cost estimated at 80,000 German soldiers killed or captured and 150,000 civilians dead, reflected the futility of defending a capital with no possibility of victory or meaningful negotiation. As Berlin fell, the rest of the Reich fragmented into regional collapses. In the north, Admiral from his command post near the Danish border attempted to maintain an authority that was already fictitious. His declared goal was to prolong the resistance in the east while negotiating partial surrenders with the British and Americans, allowing as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to escape Soviet control. This policy created a chaotic operational situation. Some units were ordered to continue fighting, others to retreat westward, and still others to surrender locally. The coherence of command had disappeared. In Italy, Marshall's Army Group C, having resisted for months on successive defensive lines along the conducted secret negotiations that culminated in the surrender on May 2nd, effective from the same day. Approximately 600,000 German soldiers laid down their arms, eliminating the last organized front south of the Alps. In Europe, Marshal Busch, commander of German forces in the Netherlands, Denmark, and North Germany, signed the surrender to Marshal Montgomery on May 4th. This capitulation included all naval, ground, and air forces in those sectors. In Czechoslovakia, the Prague uprising on May 5th complicated the situation for Marshall, commander of Army Group Center, which was retreating from attempted to maintain corridors open to the west to allow his troops to surrender to the Americans rather than to the Soviets. The operational confusion, conflicting orders from local initiatives, and the collapse of communications resulted in some formations reaching American lines, others being surrounded by Soviet and Czech forces, and still others simply dissolving. The formal act of capitulation was executed in 2 stages. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl on behalf of the government signed the unconditional surrender in before Western Allied representatives. Effective from 2301, on May 8 the Soviet Union insisted on an additional ceremony in Berlin to reflect its role in the German defeat. On May 8 marshals signed the surrender. Instrument before Marshal and in as of 2301, on May 8, 1945 the German armed forces officially ceased combat operations in Europe. The formal surrender did not result in an immediate and simultaneous cessation of all combat. Some units in isolated sectors, especially those attempting to reach Western lines from the east, continued to fight briefly. Others, without communication with higher command, continued defending positions until they received delayed orders. However, the structure of the Reich as a political and military entity had ceased to exist days before the formal capitulation. The government was detained by British forces on May 23, eliminating the last semblance of independent German authority. The final collapse of the Reich was not the result of a single decisive factor, but of the convergence of accumulated impossibilities from months before, that consumed the last offensive reserves in the West without altering the strategic balance. The Soviet offensive in January eliminated the defensive depth in the East. Crossing of the destroyed the last geographical barrier in the West. The Ruhr Pocket wiped out the industrial core in Berlin, marked the end of the political and symbolic center. Each stage was the logical consequence of the previous one, not a series of isolated mistakes. The Reich ended because it had lost the ability to choose not only where to fight but how to lose. The surrender on May 8 formalized a fate. Germany had ceased to exist as an independent actor in its own war weeks before the last shot was fired. May 8, 1945, why Germany surrendered twice. On April 30, 1945, committed suicide in the Weil. Soviet forces were fighting less than 500 meters away. His death did not stop the fighting in Berlin. General continued directing the defense until May 2, but it removed the last link that held the German command structure together. What was left of the Reich no longer responded to a coherent political center, but rather to a series of local decisions made by commanders who were evaluating how to manage their own surrenders. Death was not the end of the war, it was the formal confirmation that the German command system had ceased to exist as a functional entity days before. His political testament appointed Admiral Karl as his successor, established a provisional government in the Danish border in the small strip of territory still not occupied by Allied or Soviet forces, but this government lacked real strategic capacity. It did not control enough territory to sustain military operations. It had no resources to influence the course of events, and it was not recognized by any Allied power as a legitimate interlocutor. Its only practical function was to transmit orders of capitulation and manage the process of surrender for the scattered German forces. Its priority was clear from the very beginning: to prolong the resistance in the East for the minimum time necessary to allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible to reach the Western lines and surrender to the British or Americans rather than to the Soviets. This policy created a situation in which some units were ordered to continue fighting while others negotiated local. In Berlin, General realized on May 1 that the defense of the city had lost all operational meaning. Ammunition was running out, defensive sectors had been reduced to a perimeter of just a few square kilometers, and there was no possibility of external relief. He requested authorization to attempt a breakout to the west with the remnants of his forces. The response from his government was ambiguous: maintain resistance while negotiating a general surrender, but it was practically irrelevant. On May 2 ordered the of organized resistance and personally surrendered to the Soviet command. The surrender of Berlin was not simultaneous across all sectors. Isolated groups continued fighting for hours. Some attempted to break through the encirclement toward the west with almost always fatal results, and complete resistance did not cease until the evening of May 2. The fall of the capital marked the end of the symbolic center of the Reich, but tens of thousands of German soldiers were still fighting on other fronts, some unaware of what had happened in Berlin and others following orders from local commanders attempting to negotiate their own surrender terms. Regional surrenders began before the formal end. In Italy, the Army Group C of Marshall, who had succeeded Ring, was facing an unsustainable situation by the end of April. The Allied offensive north of the Po River had broken through the German defenses, and the partisan uprising in the northern cities disrupted Communications. Secret negotiations that had been ongoing for weeks through Swiss intermediaries culminated on April 29th. With the signing of a surrender that would take effect on May 2nd, approximately 600,000 German soldiers laid down their arms in Italy, eliminating an entire front before the general surrender of the Reich was signed. From the perspective of the High Command, the Italian surrender was an act of insubordination. Had not authorized partial surrenders, but he lacked the means to prevent or punish it. In Europe, the situation rapidly evolved after the collapse of the Ruhr Pocket. Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of the German forces in the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark, controlled formations that had become isolated from the rest of the Reich by the advancing Allies, with no possibility of receiving reinforcements or executing strategic maneuvers. Busch assessed that prolonging resistance would only increase destruction without altering the outcome. On May 4th, German representatives signed the surrender of all forces in the northwest before Marshal Montgomery, including naval, ground, and air units. This regional surrender allowed for a relatively orderly transition. German troops surrendered their arms, were concentrated in prisoner of war camps, and the territory passed under Allied control without the destructive fighting that had characterized other areas. Meanwhile, in the east, the situation was radically different. The German formations still fighting in Bohemia, Austria, and southern Germany were executing chaotic retreats to the west, trying to reach the American lines before being surrounded by Soviet forces. Marshal Ferdinand, commander of Army Group Center, received contradictory orders. He was instructed to maintain resistance to cover the evacuation of civilians and soldiers to the west. From the field, his subordinate commanders informed him that organized resistance was already impossible and that the units were into scattered groups seeking to escape individually. The retreat through Bohemia took place under constant pressure from Soviet and Czechoslovak forces, with massive losses of heavy equipment and the progressive disintegration of the command structure. The Prague uprising on May 5th further complicated the situation. When the Czech population rose up against the German occupation, units passing through the city found themselves trapped between the insurgents and the advancing Red Army from the east. Some German commanders negotiated locally with the insurgents for safe passage to the west. Others fought their way through, and some simply surrendered to the Czech forces. They found themselves surrounded. The command structure of army groups sent completely fragmented. Each corps, each division, often each regiment, made their own decisions about when and to whom to surrender. The formal order to lay down arms reached many units with days of delay or never reached them at all. On the Baltic coast, the army group, isolated there since October 1944, continued to resist in a pocket. With no land connection to the Reich, the troops, approximately 180,000 soldiers in May 1945, had fought for months on a front that held no strategic value, sustained by intermittent supplies by sea. When the orders of capitulation arrived, many units received them with disbelief. They had spent months fighting in isolation, unaware that the Reich had completely collapsed. The surrender in Caen was carried out gradually between May 8th and 10th, with formations surrendering their weapons to Soviet forces that were surrounding them on all sides. The formal surrender process began with negotiations between the German High Command and the Western Allies. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff and envoy, signed the unconditional surrender document of all German armed forces in Reims, General Eisenhower's headquarters. The document established the of hostilities at 231 on May 8th. From Jodl's perspective, the signature was the formal recognition of a completed defeat. There were no resources left to continue the war. Territory was occupied and the military structure was disintegrated. However, the signing in Reims created political complication. The Soviet Union argued that the capitulation should be in Berlin, the conquered capital, and with explicit Soviet participation in the formal act. On May 8th, early in the morning, a second surrender ceremony was held in Karlsruhe, Berlin. Marshal, head of the OKW, signed the instrument of surrender in front of Marshal, representing the Soviets, and Marshal Arthur, representing the Western Allies. This second signing did not alter the terms of the surrender. They were identical to those in Reims. But it satisfied the Soviet political demand that the German defeat be formalized in territory conquered by the Red Army. For the German soldiers on the ground, the distinction between Reims and Berlin was irrelevant. What mattered was when the orders to lay down arms would arrive and how that order would be executed in their specific sector. Effective of hostilities was uneven, in the West where communications worked better and where surrendering to Western forces was perceived as less threatening, the of combat was relatively orderly. German units surrendered their weapons at designated points, were registered and transferred to prisoner of war camps. In the East, the situation was much more chaotic. Many German units continued to fight after 2301 on May 8, not due to deliberate insubordination but because the orders hadn't arrived or because they were trying to break through to the West before surrendering. Formations moving through Czechoslovakia continued to face Soviet and Czech forces on May 9 and 10. The last organized combat was recorded in some sectors of Bohemia until May 11, when the remnants of the Army Group Center finally laid down their arms after reaching positions where they could surrender to American forces. Provisional government continued to function nominally until May 23, when British forces arrested its members and dissolved the structure. During those 2 weeks, the government focused on transmitting surrender orders, managing the evacuation of refugees, and negotiating minor conditions with the Allies, but it lacked real authority. It didn't control territory, had no significant military forces, and wasn't recognized as a sovereign entity. Its existence was briefly tolerated because it facilitated the orderly transmission of surrender orders, but once this process was completed, it became useless. The arrest of and his collaborators marked the formal disappearance of the last of independent German authority. May 8, 1945 legally formalized a fate of Germany had ceased to exist as an independent actor in its own war weeks before the final shot was fired. What followed was the occupation of territory, not the defeat of a functional state.